Welcome to today's session, Milliseconds Matter, Defending Against the Next Zero-Day Exploit. Really sincerely appreciate you all taking the time to join us today. I know everyone's got packed calendars. There's a lot of things going on here at the beginning of the year, but it does mean a lot to have you here. Our speakers, who I'll introduce in just a second, have put together, I think, a really excellent session for us all this afternoon, hitting on some really important issues within the cybersecurity industry. First up is Jim Routh. Jim has more than 35 years of experience in information technology and is a widely respected cybersecurity expert. He currently serves as an advisor, investor, and board member for a number of cybersecurity companies. He's also a former CISO or CSO at MassMutual, Aetna, and JP Morgan. Our second panelist is Buck Bell. Buck is the Executive Vice President of Technology Integration at Focal Point, now a CDW company. Buck has 20 years of experience specifically in identity and access management, and is also a widely respected thought leader in the field of cybersecurity. Thank you to both of our panelists for their time, both in preparing the session today and in delivering it to you all this afternoon. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Buck to get the conversation started.
All right, Casey, thanks. And I want to echo something that Casey said, just in terms of everyone joining today. It's a busy time for sure. So your participation means a lot to us. And hopefully we'll be able to give you some information today that, that's meaningful to you as well in terms of what we're seeing out there in the market with these zero-day assaults and folks who are looking for ways to try to solve them. So I am going to work here. I now have control to advance the screens. So when we talk about zero-day exploits, there's no one on this call, I assume, who's not familiar with this topic and familiar with what's happened over the last several years. The most recent exploit, of course, that we've seen comes from the Log4j issue that arose right at the end of last year. But before that was SolarWinds, and before that was another one and another one and another one. So this has been an omnipresent issue for any number of years in a row. There's been a little bit of whack-a-mole trying to chase how to solve for these exploits. And one of the things we're going to lead you through today is how Versec has taken a little bit of a different approach around trying to solve for this problem. But we know for sure that even though this has happened, previously, it is absolutely going to happen again as well. I have a couple of statistics here that I thought were really, really interesting. So without belaboring it, in the middle of the Log4j experience that we all had, within the first 12 hours of that exploit being made public, there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 attacks that had been recorded around the world. 24 hours, within one day, 120,000 attacks had been recorded. And by 36 hours, it was 400,000. And then 72 hours, 3 days, there were over 830,000 unique attacks that had been identified. That's just a tremendous number by any stretch. And we know that this is a critical risk, and that time to solution is a critical factor of that. There's kind of some second numbers on here that are very interesting as well, though, and I've got those as well. So within 12 hours of the initial attack, there were 11 variants that had appeared on networks across the world. And within 72 hours, there were 45 variants. It seems like all we talk about is variants anymore in any factor of our lives, but in this case, it's no different, that this exploit had 45 variants within 3 hours, which again means that even some exploit management, some patching activities may have not been fully fruitful, and there was a need to revisit this. In North America, there were 46% of networks that were impacted across 3 days. 46% of networks in North America impacted by the Log4j exploit. And that number is almost 49% as a global average. So what do all those numbers mean other than just being sort of generally interesting? What it really says is that the time to solution is probably one of the more critical X factors in preventing data exploitation. And if there's an opportunity to prevent these at the outset, that's probably even a better solution, right? When you and I sit here and think about almost half the networks in North America being subject to an exploit, the nature of the Log4j exploit is such that the exfiltration of X500 or LDAP style data was probably quite high. We may never know the full impact of it. But what we do know is that this is critical information in the enterprise and that folks are still trying to determine what the loss may have been. So when we talk about the zero-day vulnerabilities, just at a basic level, the idea is that the attackers find a vulnerability. Sometimes these are malicious actors, sometimes it's white hat, but there is a vulnerability that's found, and it could be, at the edge layer, it could be at an application layer. There are lots of places these exploits can live. But they then, once they found this vulnerability, prepare an attack and then execute against that attack. On the defense side, what that means is you have the potential of always being behind the eight ball, right? You're reacting to a vulnerability you didn't know existed previously. You don't know the nature of the exploit necessarily until it begins to be actionable, or there's enough information in the media or security networks to help defend against it. And then ultimately, you're trying to understand how to manage your own control frameworks and how to detect where not only the initial entry into the network may have occurred, but also if there's been any lateral movement across network assets. So the attacker defender, I guess just the balance between the two is always on reactivity. So the question comes up, hey, once these vulnerabilities come up, can't we just patch them? And certainly there's some truth to that, right? I mean, the idea that you would clearly want to patch exploits that were discovered is sort of self-evident. But one of the things that's really interesting that we're seeing in the marketplace is, and this was, go back 3, 4, 5 years ago, it wasn't as present as we're seeing it develop now, is the question around cyber insurance. And this is one that sometimes doesn't get as much thinking. So patching either proactively or in some cases patching after the fact, which could leave exploits resident for a long time in your network. That's one way to try to address it. And I'll explain in a moment why maybe that's not perfectly ideal. But when you kind of start talking about the cyber insurance aspect of this, for folks who are on the buyer side of cyber insurance, you probably experienced towards the end of last year some new requirements from the cyber insurance teams for you to be able to continue that coverage, right? So the cyber insurance folks are smart, and they have figured out that companies, as is in the case of insurance of any kind, will kind of arbitrage a little bit, right? Meaning, well, if we have to pay extra cyber insurance and we believe our maximum loss is Y, what's the difference between those two, and how much should we invest to try to protect ourselves from attack? Well, for the Log4j exploit and others that may be similar to it, the opportunity for loss, in both financial and reputational, is quite high. So the cyber insurance teams have become much more interested in this, and they're starting to push out greater requirements onto the businesses that are consumers of that insurance. Last year, the big one that hit was having multi-factor authentication around VPNs, right? That was the one that we heard most often from our client base. Folks were trying to satisfy that requirement by the end of the year if they didn't have it all in place. But I guarantee you we're going to see more like that in coming years. So the opportunity not only to just be defensive and even be very good defensively, I think it's going to be superseded not only by the need to get ahead of the game in general, but also by some of these business pressures that are coming from requirements from cyber insurers. So patching certainly is part of the solution, but again, it doesn't entirely let you get ahead of the game. So there's a case study here, which is that when Microsoft announced in 2021 that there had been a zero-day vulnerability that they had been detected on Exchange server, within 5 minutes, there had been exploits appearing against those vulnerabilities. 5 minutes. And that lines right up with what we just talked about Log4j, right? I mean, 830,000 exploits within a 3-day period. The teams are getting much more sophisticated in terms of ransomware attacks that come as a consequence of this, or just purely malicious attempts to exfiltrate data. So why does anybody care about this other than that's our jobs in security, right? Well, frankly, what it all boils down to is data protection. And when you look at the data that you're trying to protect, CISOs have told us, the analyst community, et cetera, that they have several priorities. There's an increasing adoption of zero trust. Now, some folks may be snickering and thinking that's kind of a buzzword, but we all know what the intent is around zero trust. The idea that you don't necessarily trust an access attempt or an access that would persist in an environment, you're constantly reauthorizing, reauthenticating users if necessary. Multi-factor authentication can be part of that. But ultimately that you don't have expansive trust and you know who is trying to access what at all times. So there's an adoption of zero trust, and that's a very good thing. But again, that is a long period of maturity, right? That's 2, 3, 4, 5 years. There's nothing bad about that. It's all positive. The second one that we're hearing a lot is that they're looking to train users to respond to unexpected security events. Well, almost definitionally, security events are somewhat unexpected, or you might have prepared for them. So every time one of these pops up, it's a little bit different than the one previously. But process-wise, our clients are telling us they want to be able to put in place more things in front, not only to let end users recognize what certain vulnerabilities or attack vectors might look like, but structurally how their teams can better respond to those attacks. And then finally, security outsourcing is gaining steam. And what I think that means, in part at least, is many entities have realized, hey, we may not have the expertise internally to solve for this, so we're looking for external expertise. But when you kind of take that down another level, what they're really saying is, we're looking for ways to make this easier, faster, maybe at a lower cost. Maybe we can even consolidate tool sets, right? They need to find ways that are efficient to protect the data that lives in their environment. So when it boils down to all this, and I kind of made reference to it before, there's a profile of security spending that's occurring right now. Now, everybody's happy to spend in the wake of a security event or a breach, right? That's just one of the unfortunate truths. Sometimes it's harder to gain support in advance of a breach, but once it happens, everyone's interested in trying to remediate that. So what we were seeing, there was a little bit of a shift in the environment. Many of our clients are being asked, hey, we know you need a business function and you need to go spend around this, but is there any impact to our security posture around that? This is coming from the boards, even from the CIO, from the CISO, even from the CEO in some cases. Like, how is this impacting our security posture, if at all? Those questions are coming up. There is more focus on things like zero trust and SOAR to help orchestration around the security processes that may exist. But we see that security services, our skilled staff is 20%, security services 27%, on-prem infrastructure 20%. There's comprehensive and broad-based security spending that is occurring. And again, I think it all comes down to the same thing, which is, are these points of spend helping us secure the data that is important to our business? And this is ultimately about the way that CISOs today in particular, but organizations in general, are making that data protection more real. So when you kind of take it down a level from the high level of priorities, we know that companies are seeking more real-time vulnerability management. In other words, 2, 3, 4, 5 days of residency, 6 weeks of residency. Those are challenging numbers to absorb when you realize that there are 800,000 attacks and 45 variants that are being produced in 3 days, as was the case of Log4j. So reducing kind of the dwell time where folks can live in the environment, and also trying to more quickly identify and remediate against attacks, those are top priorities. Protecting operational technology has been a big one that we've seen pop up recently. So not only IT, but OT. And then obviously ensuring compliance is always an overlay to this as well. And I would just go back and reference again the cyber insurance part, while maybe not directly related to compliance per se, is starting to factor in heavily. So we know that there are still some gaps, and those priorities kind of speak to some of those gaps that exist today. So I'm about to turn this over to Jim for a little bit more detail around Versec and what he's seen from his experience. But the idea ultimately is, can you build a full stack data protection that covers web, memory, host, that is in some cases complementary to existing investments that may have been made around EDR, XDR, WAF. In some cases, maybe it can take the place of some of the functions that those solutions provide, to help protect more comprehensively against all the threats that are going in, those unknown vulnerabilities, right, that by definition are almost always the case. Is there an opportunity to take a more comprehensive view and to stop these events in their tracks before they really even start? And so with that, I am, having set the stage a little bit, going to turn it back over to Casey. I think we're going to run a poll and just get a feeling from the team here, what you're feeling like in terms of the way that you're approaching some of these topics today.
So let's talk about what the potential approach to solve this problem is. And we've got to divide the world into the conventional security practices, which we know very well that we're operating in today, and we're calling them probabilistic approaches. And we're introducing really a new paradigm, a game-changing capability we're defining as true runtime protection, and that's a deterministic perspective on security. What does it mean? It means that, for as long as I've been in cybersecurity, we always study the forensic trail of threat actor activity. And it's tremendously valuable to do that, to understand how threat actors use tactics that permeate against vulnerabilities in our environment. It's kind of a foundational component of cybersecurity for all of our cybersecurity programs. But we typically, when there is an event, attack, an incident, we take our best talent and we have them pour through log files and build a scenario of events that happened in the past. And we're looking after the fact to what occurred in order to determine how to put corrective actions in place to contain the damage of the attack, and then ultimately how to remediate that to prevent attacks in the future. And it's significantly labor intensive, and it's all applied after the event. And that's essentially a probabilistic approach. And we have today an ability to apply a deterministic approach. So let's look a little bit about what a deterministic approach is. In this case, of course, I went too far in my slides. So in this case, we have application awareness combined with runtime protection. What that means is applications are supposed to perform within boundaries that are predetermined. And if we can isolate the activities to what's in the boundaries, it's all good. It's what the application was designed to do. If there are attempts to break out of those boundaries, then that's malicious in intent, and it's the product of threat actor activity. And so what we're doing is understanding what good is in terms of application behavior and performance, and we're bounding the operation to what is determined to be good. And we're preventing the malicious attacks outside of that boundary. Now, what this does for us from a time sequence is that we have this capability in our runtime today. And so if there's initial reconnaissance that takes place and some malware that makes it through whatever controls that we have in place into the runtime, that's blocked from doing anything at the point where the infection occurs. And so rather than spending time and effort on the back end after the fact, we're preventing damage and access to sensitive data at the time of execution in runtime. And that's a game changer that fundamentally changes the economics of how we apply this. So the way we apply resources today, what we're doing is we're studying what's happened. We're sometimes using some enhanced tools, some AI and ML capability to optimize and do event correlation to have better understand that. And then we're continuing the triage and hunting of threat actor activity. And then ultimately with context in our environment, we're responding. And the more sensitive the event is, the more resources we pour into this activity. All of it is after the fact. And so the operational costs continue to escalate for breach and incident response. And the alternative model is to map what good code execution is, and then only allow good code execution, which stops any attacker activity instantly, immediately. And it's not guesswork, because anything outside of the boundary of good application performance is stopped. So instead of reacting from a human perspective to alerts, we're actually preventing the breaches from occurring at that point. So, sorry, my slide, let's try this. So the economic model of how we apply resources fundamentally changes. And that's why this is a game changer. So it's a zero trust model for your workload. It's immediate. And you don't have to spend time and effort collecting, log data, and then applying analyst activity to understanding that data and interpreting that. And essentially, this is full stack protection. And I call it a backstop for all the other controls in your environment. This is the one that's your backstop that you can count on to be that backstop against all the other controls. And it fundamentally changes your security posture. And the cost model actually over time goes down. So instead of increasing costs and labor and high use of highly specialized resource, it's going the other way. It's there's less resource than you need, and you're stopping the attacks. You can be proactive and spend some of the excess benefit of productivity of your SOC analysts to do other types of cyber hunting. But essentially, this is what makes this so compelling. It's you don't have any of the damage from security breaches that you have to manage from a business perspective. And essentially, you're stopping attacks in real time as a result. That's true workload runtime protection. And there are other capabilities that are in the market that you can choose from, but this is the paradigm that you should be using of looking for that true runtime protection. And it's a game changer in terms of the economic value proposition to an enterprise. And it also really removes us from the burden of a very labor-intensive, even through automation, of labor-intensive process of patch management that's following after the fact of the breach. And so, VerSec stops the threats, as they occur. And so that's why I call it a backstop protection capability, and it supplements everything else that you have, but it's clearly it's a game changer. And as you go through your list of controls that you rely on in your enterprise, you should have some activities investigating true runtime protection. If you don't start it, it's tremendously worthwhile. The economics are in the favor of the enterprise, given what we're spending today to follow this cycle. And as I said, it's a game-changing technology that you need to investigate, understand, feel comfortable with, and move forward with. So I think we have time for questions, and I think we have a few questions that we can answer. So I'll turn that back to either Casey or Buck.
We'll leave the line open for another minute here and see if we have any other questions that want to come in. In the meantime, I'd give either Buck or Jim an opportunity to sort of share any final thoughts now that we've walked through the content. Any other sort of like key takeaways you want to leave the group with while we wait for any final questions to come in?
Yeah, so I'll tell you this from a CISO perspective. When SolarWinds happened, I was like, okay, this is deja vu, because the lessons learned from NotPetya directly apply to the software security poisoning attack of SolarWinds. And, there were some differences, but frankly, multi-billion dollars worth of impact tend to get our attention. And I'll say this honestly, I don't think I did a good enough job applying the lessons learned from NotPetya when SolarWinds happened. Now, it didn't impact we were a customer of SolarWinds. We used Orion, but it didn't have a significant impact to our enterprise, but it certainly did to many, many other enterprises. And so I think we have to get a little bit more, I'll say disciplined about applying the lessons learned. And one of the lessons learned, fortunately, because of my involvement with Versec very early on, this goes back three years or so, maybe 3 years in time, is that I immediately committed to understanding this technology, trying it out in our environment, and learning from it, because I recognized that instead of chasing our tails, this was a preventative capability that could be that backstop potential. And the technology has matured. The version that we have today is much easier to deploy and deal with whatever anomalies are in your environment in terms of integration issues. It's much simpler today. So I just encourage all of you, choose your favorite product, whatever it is, but do explore runtime protection and get comfortable with it as a cornerstone control that you'll use for years in your environment. And frankly, you can use it in legacy applications. In a legacy environment, you can use it in cloud applications in your workloads. And it's a game changer economically and in terms of the resiliency that you can realize for your enterprise. So get comfortable with it. Learn it. Learn how it works in your environment. Spend time and effort doing so. It's well worth it. And certainly Versec has a really mature capability, and it's well worth it.
I think that's great insight and great advice, Jim. There has been another question that came in through the Q&A. I think I'll direct it at you because I think it might be a question best answered through the Versec lens. But the question is sort of an open-ended one about false positives and the role that plays in runtime detection. So I thought maybe you could speak briefly just about how Versec handles false positives in comparison to other technologies that are out there.
Yeah, so it's the biggest concern and issue for any cybersecurity professional when you make any changes to the production environment of any kind is, will it disrupt my business? And will it disrupt operations? Will it impact availability? And so you can deploy this deterministic workload runtime protection capability in an alert mode that tells you when there's activity that's outside of the parameters of what the application is supposed to do. And you can test that over time to get some level of comfort relative to what would be a false positive if a behavioral attribute of the application triggers protection. You can just alert on that, study it, understand it, tune and adjust it until you get to the point where you're comfortable that it's in the preventative mode where you don't have to do anything and you have full protection. And whether that's days, hours, weeks, months, that's your control. So you determine that. And I say you really your SOC and your operations team, your infrastructure team, they'll decide that. And you can decide that in segments of your environment. It's not an all or nothing proposition. As a matter of fact, the best advice is deploy this to a small subset of devices and then grow that, continually grow incrementally the number of devices. And then, determine when you feel comfortable turning on that prevent mode. And you can choose to do that by segment. And it's when you, and I say you collectively, it's your team from an operations infrastructure and from a application and cybersecurity perspective. When your team feels comfortable, you can decide that. And so you're not dealing with false positives. There are some, like every environment I've ever been in is a large, complex environment with a whole bunch of idiosyncrasies and legacy applications that are kind of quirky, and you got to just deal with that. And so it's not one of those things that fits like a glove day one. You have to customize. You have to do the implementation, follow the implementation path, and do the level of integration required for whatever your scope is. But once you do that, I think you're going to find a great deal of confidence in running it in the prevent mode and moving on to your next environment and incrementally working your way through the entire enterprise. There have been some pretty extensive tests that have been done, basically penetration tests by the government, that federal government agencies that were shared broadly across all the federal agencies in terms of the results, and they're pretty impressive. They really are. So this is a mature technology that is available to us today. That represents game-changing capability.
Great, thanks. A couple more questions have come in, so I'll keep them going. I'm going to direct this next one to Buck. The question is, and it may be a little tongue-in-cheek, but we'll take it seriously here. With VerSec deployed, why do we need to patch security vulnerabilities at all?
Yeah, actually, I really like this question because it is funny, and I think sometimes we can take ourselves pretty seriously. And I know it was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but given the question, it's probably worth talking about something that is real in these environments. So many of us recall, I will say 5-6 years ago, a large company who had spent a lot of money on security, or which had spent a lot of money on security and took it quite seriously, was subject to an exploitation of a patch on a largely independent server instance that was dedicated to onboarding users in Central America. And what they didn't realize at the time is that server had somehow escaped patching and was subject to initial attack vulnerability. It was successfully executed. Once it was executed, there was lateral movement within the network through privileged access, which resulted in about 80 million identities being exfiltrated from that particular company. That's a striking thing to say. We forgot to patch a server and we lost 80 million identities. Wow. And the reality is we all face, maybe that's at the extreme end, but we all face those kinds of situations when we're focusing just on patch management. Now, again, that question being tongue-in-cheek, of course, we want to continue to do patch management. Security or vulnerabilities aren't even the only reason you'd be doing patch management. But the important point about that is that it is possible, particularly as business needs sometimes outgrow the security model that you have in place. Somebody stands up a server somewhere and somehow that gets network attached. And we've all seen these kinds of things happen in the real world. There's an opportunity to use a variety of tools, not just VerSec in this particular instance, but to use a variety of tools to scan and to find those vulnerabilities, but also to put in place safeguards. This idea that Jim described about the deterministic model that can reduce the ability to kind of enforce these unexpected events at the application layer to milliseconds. That's wildly different than trying to just improve the outcome of forensic analysis. Let's make that faster, faster, faster. That's not a bad approach. It's gotten some of the response times down to pretty low levels, but not so much milliseconds. So there's places for all this stuff to live. Even the best managed environments, however, from a patch management perspective, sometimes things slip through, and the community out there that's looking to exploit those does not sleep.
Yeah, Rafi, the question you're asking, actually, we had the same discussion when WAF technology was first introduced, and do you have to fix software if you have vulnerabilities because you have a WAF protecting you? It's kind of, and the best way to answer that question is you have a choice. You have a choice when you patch. I wouldn't say if. I don't think patching goes away. That's my perspective. I think patching time, effort, and labor becomes a choice. And the reason you have a choice is because you have that backstop in place. And it's nice to have choices. Does that mean you just ignore patching altogether? I don't think so. I don't think that was the case with WAF technology. I don't think it's the case with runtime protection. I don't think it's the case at all, because defense in depth is what it's ingrained in our DNA. But it's really nice to know that you don't have to do it over the weekend or, at the middle of the morning, or that you can plan for that and utilize resource time effectively without burning out your staff. And so it gives you a lot more flexibility.
That's great. I love the idea of it as a backstop. I think that makes a lot of sense. It's a great way to think about it. We've got one more question here that I'll send your way, Jim. Is VerSec agent-based, or do you instrument the code with something?
Yeah, you don't instrument any code in your applications. Basically, you install VerSec. It studies your runtime environment, studies the application parameters, and it comes up with establishing those parameters over time that you then enforce, and you choose how to enforce that, whether you want to alert or whether you want to identify or just prevent. It's totally your choice. You can do it device by device. You can do it across a category of types of devices. You do it at the application level. You could, in terms of the applications and the device they use. You've got a lot of flexibility in terms of how you mix and match and do the implementation. Again, most organizations, from what I'm told, start small with a segment and then grow that significantly over time as they get a lot more comfortable with both the operation of the product, but also the deployment practices for their environment. So yeah, so you don't have to change application code is kind of the simple answer.
Great. Well, that looks like the end of our questions. So I'm going to go ahead and wind this down. I want to start by thanking you, Jim and Buck, for your time, for putting this presentation together and sharing with us all today. I want to thank the team at VerSec who worked closely with us on putting this together. And I want to thank everyone who attended. Like as I said at the beginning, I know there's a lot of demands in your time, so we appreciate you chose to spend this hour with us. And then you'll see at the bottom of your screen there the URLs for both VerSec and Focal Point. If you'd like to schedule a demo of the VerSec platform, I believe that URL down there is the best way to go. If you'd like to talk about enterprise security strategy or application security strategy, or anything else security related with Focal Point, that's focal-point.com. I would be happy to talk to you. If you want to talk to both together, that's even better. We can talk about how VerSec can fit into your enterprise security program. So with that, I want to thank you again and have a great day.